Hello, and welcome to the Roaring Twenties. For those of you who are new to my channel, I have a major challenge this year where I read one book published every year from 1900 to 2020. You can see this in the viewfinder. January was 1900 to 1910, February 1911 to 1920, and March is 1921 to 1930. Today I'm going to go over my TBR for what I plan to read this month, and feel free in the comments to let me know what you think. If you've read any of these books, if you're excited to hear about what other people think of them, or you were thinking about reading it on your own and you kind of want to hear more about it, what I think. Before we get into the TBR, I want to start by kind of recapping what was going on in the 20s. So you have a little bit of an idea of what contemporary literature is going to look like at this time. 1920s had a huge economic boom after World War I, so everybody was wealthy. In the Americas, the 1920s were called the Roaring Twenties, and in Europe it was called the Golden Age 20s. 1920s has like a rise in like radical things, whether it was jazz music, fashion, political ideas, communism, fascism, art styles, where it was more modernist art styles are starting to come in the 1920s. Fashion entered the modern era where women began dressing more for comfort instead of modesty. So dresses got shorter, underlayers went away, and a very straight, skinny silhouette was popular among women. There were big movements in other non-white cultures as well. The 20s is like the peak of the Harlem Renaissance, where African Americans are having their own cultural renaissance in the Harlem district of New York City. At the end of the 20s, 1929, Wall Street crashes. The prosperity that the Western world has seen for the past decade tailors off, and then we go into the 1930s where we have the Depression era and eventually World War II. For 1921, I am reading American Indian Stories by Zitkala Sa, and Zitkala is a famous Sioux writer and activist, and this little group of short stories is children's tales and essays about the Sioux culture, and it was considered controversial at the time, and also calling it American Indian is obviously not culturally acceptable anymore. Native American, but obviously when this was written, the standard naming scheme for Native Americans in the United States were considered Indians, American Indians. The purpose of this work was to like bridge a gap between modern society and the Sioux culture. And this just sounds like a very, very interesting book that is absolutely nothing like anything else that I read last month or that I plan to read this month. So I'm glad to get a different take on a non-white dominated Western culture for at least one book this month. For 1922, I was planning to read Ulysses by James Joyce, but oh my god, I hated his writing so much in A Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man, and this is a thick book that I was like, you know what, screw this, I want to see what else is out there. And what I found sounds so much more interesting than reading some old-fashioned white man. And that is Diary of a Drug Fiend by Aleister Crowley. And this is a book that it's considered one of the first fiction novels that really addresses drug addiction. That two lovers are traveling Europe on a cocaine and heroin fantasy high, and eventually the drugs run out, and it goes from everything is perfect drug fantasy to dealing with drug withdrawals. And this is the first book really ever to address that addiction is a thing instead of just people can't handle themselves. So, sounds way better than Ulysses. I'm sorry for all of those who wanted me to read the classics. I'm more interested in this one. Next up, we gotta throw a children's book in there, right? I've got Bambi, A Life in the Woods. I don't know who it's by Felix Sultan. And I think most of you have probably seen Bambi, the Disney movie, right? This is a children's coming-of-age story, except for it's about a deer. And Bambi's mom dies. Next up, I'm reading a short story by H.P. Lovecraft called A Rat in the Walls, and I have it as part of the Necronomicon. This short story is about a man, an American man, who travels back to his English ancestry home and starts hearing scratching at the walls, like there's rats in the walls. But this is H.P. Lovecraft, and this shit's horror, so you know those are not rats, and it's gonna be creepy as shit. For 1925, I am reading the quintessential 1920s novel, which is The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. The copy I happen to have is really, really awesome. I bought this last year when traveling to Korea, and you have the story in English on this side, and then the story in Korean side by side. So it's about half of this length because this is the same story twice, but it just kind of gave me excuse to read this really cool copy of a book that I picked up in Seoul last year. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with The Great Gatsby, like I said, it's the quintessential 1920s novel. Like, if you say, name a book from the 1920s, this is probably going to be what everybody names. It is about Gatsby and Daisy, and they are in love, and Gatsby is stupid wealthy, and he throws a lot of parties, and drama, and gin. I think that mostly covers it, right? Next up, I have The Castle by Frank Kafka. This also has a character in it whose initial is just K. I like it. A gentleman named K travels to a village to take up a position as a land surveyor for the lord of the castle. And he just kind of wants to contact his new employer and go about his duties, but the villagers and the castle officials block him in every way from doing what he came here to do. And he just basically has this unrelenting desire to break through into the inner workings of the castle and come do what he was hired to do. And it's an interesting, mysterious kind of story. I don't know a whole lot about it. I just know it's a really popular novel. Next up in similar edition is To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf. And from what I understand, this is a book about a woman named Miss Ramsey. In it, apparently, according to the synopsis on the front cover, she dies halfway through the book, but she's still like the main driving force of the novel. And it's just, this is well known not necessarily for like the plot, but just Virginia Woolf's prose and the narrative and just how amazing of a writer she is. So it doesn't seem like what the story is about is too particularly relevant to people's love for this classic. So next up is Lady Chatterley's Lover by D.H. Lawrence. And this book was written and finished in 1928. It's detailed descriptions of lovemaking and frank language prevented it from being published unedited until 1959. And even in 1959, the publisher was arrested and only ended up winning free after a very lengthy court battle. And this just depicts a affair between Lady Chatterley and her gatekeeper. But I am totally down to read something that was so graphic it couldn't be printed until almost 1960, and then the publisher still got arrested for it in 1960. So this is gonna be some smut. That's what this is gonna be. Now, next up is another book that is just endlessly associated with the 1920s because it came out at the end of World War I, and it is about World War I. Most of us had to read this book when we were in school, and that is All Quiet on the Western Front by Eric Remarque. Hard to say. This is just a straight up story of World War I, and it is very well written and very well known. So I read this when I was very young. I don't even remember how long ago, but I don't really remember anything about it other than it was really sad. So it's reread, but I probably didn't care about it the first time I read it because I had to read it for school. Right? Right. And just because we can't possibly end the month on a depressing, sad note, the last book we're reading this month is the first book in the Nancy Drew series, which is The Secret of the Old Clock by Carolyn Keene. Now, Nancy Drew is a young girl who is a detective. She's a young female detective, and she solves mysteries, just like Agatha Christie novels or Sherlock Holmes, but it's written for young girls. I'm down. It sounds like fun. And that's it for the 1920s. What do you all think about my TBR for this month? Was there anything that you expected to be on here that you didn't see? Was there anything that you feel like I've just completely missed? And if you have any suggestions on what you think I should read for next month in the 1930s, drop those suggestions down in the comments. I have a TBR planned, but I am more than willing to switch out something if y'all suggest something that sounds more interesting than what I already plan to read. I will see you in the next video.